I want to talk about the Holocaust. People say, oh, David Irving's pulled back. David Irving's retracted. David Irving's revised his views. I haven't. Within a narrow band, I don't think I've changed my views very much over the years, but I've been very careful in what I say. First of all, I don't like using the word Holocaust. Where does it come from? Well, it came about 1970. If you go back before 1970, you won't find the word being used in this context at all. When I was in prison in Vienna, arrested under their banning law, I managed to persuade the Institute of History in Munich, which holds all my papers, to send me the note of the interview I had with the brother of Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS. Gebhard Himmler was his totally unimportant brother. He'd survived the war years, and there he was, living in 1971 in Munich as a retired civil servant. I went to interview him. Unfortunately, I wasn't interested in the Holocaust, as it's called at that time, because I was writing my book about Adolf Hitler. I was more interested in the relationship between his brother Heine and Hitler. Had I known I was going to write a book eventually about Himmler, I would have spent far more time talking to the brother, but he's now dead. What is interesting is at the end of my 4-page handwritten note to my interview with Heinrich Himmler's brother, I realized that although we'd talked about the Holocaust, we'd never actually used the word. And the reason is quite simple. I think that about 1972, there was a meeting somewhere in New York, Madison Avenue, where the Jewish community leaders got together and said, we want to start marketing this. We want to start bringing it to the global consciousness in the same way that you market a product like headache medicine. How can we do this? And the PR wizards had said, well, let's tell you how you're going to do this. Like any other product, you've got to give it a trade name. You've got to give it a capital letter. You've got to stress how unique it is. You've got to have a slogan. Guinness is good for you, that kind of thing. In this case, of course, it's the 6 million. Don't deviate from that slogan, no matter what other stuff comes up. And hey, you're onto a winner. You can make billions. Which, of course, is how things have gone ever since that meeting, which I suppose happened. Because from that day on, the word Holocaust is in the media. It's taken off. It's now exponentially risen. If you go to the Times Index, or the index of the New York Times in America, before 1970, you won't find the word being used. After 1972, it takes off exponentially. It's been marketed, which means that as a historian, you've got to be extra careful. So you're not being sold a bill of goods, as the Americans say. You're not being taken for a ride. I believed the whole Holocaust story. I'm not going to call it a legend. I'm not going to call it a myth either. I believed the whole Holocaust story until about 1988. If you read the first edition of my Hitler's book, there's Auschwitz in it as an extermination camp. If you read the latest edition, you won't find Auschwitz as an extermination camp. Auschwitz is described here as being a brutal slave labor camp with a very high death rate, which is probably a better description of it. It was neither one thing nor the other. And of course, certain people have taken that very much amiss, that I don't go for the whole story. If you don't go for the whole story, you're in deep trouble. Your books are not published in this town again. They're not reviewed, they're not sold. I remember my very dear old literary agent, Max Becker, saying, David, you've got to understand one thing about publishing in the United States. It isn't the fact that most of the publishing houses in the United States are Jewish, because they are. It isn't the fact that most of the paperback houses are Jewish, because all big 7 reprint houses in the United States are Jewish. Your problem isn't even the fact that most of the literary editors are Jewish. It isn't even the fact that most of the op-ed writers in American newspapers are Jewish. Your biggest problem is the fact that most people who buy books in the United States are Jewish. You're writing largely to a Jewish audience. And as the Germans say, you can't jump over your own shadow. You've got a problem when you're writing about the Holocaust. And I hadn't been aware of that problem until I started deviating. And I suppose if I'm guilty of anything, it isn't revisionism. It isn't Holocaust denial. It's what the communists used to call deviationism. I deviate from the conformist line. If you're a conformist historian like Martin Gilbert, you're going to write the conformist line and your book's going to be widely reviewed and published and sold and distributed, and you're going to live a very comfortable life. If you deviate from that line, then hey, you're in for trouble. My deviationism began in April 1988. I was living actually on a beach in Florida. I mention that because I got a phone call from Canada, from the defense team defending a German-Canadian called Ernst Zundel. I was a Hitler historian. I was an expert on the Third Reich. Would I be willing to come to Toronto within the next 1 or 2 days and give evidence in a court of law as an expert on Hitler and the Third Reich? I flew to Canada. I gave evidence in the courtroom. The judge accepted me as an expert on the Third Reich. Before I went into the witness box, defense counsel gave me a ring binder to read. He said, this is the Leuchter report, and I want you to read it because I'm going to ask you questions about it. So I read the Leuchter report for the first time. Fred Leuchter is an unassuming American engineer. He was a man who was hired by American penitentiaries as a consultant on execution technology. He gave opinions on gas chambers, he gave opinions on electric chairs, he gave opinions on gallows, and he made them conform with health and safety standards, if you can have such a thing as a health and safety standard when you're stepping into a gas chamber. He was the expert, and quite rightly, the defense team for the Ernst Zundel case in Toronto decided to pick an expert in execution technology to give an expert opinion on Nazi gas chambers. And it was a minefield. They had opened Pandora's box because Fred Leuchter was totally apolitical. He had not the slightest interest in politics. He wasn't an extremist, but he warmed to the idea of going to Poland and visiting the campsites. He wanted to see these things for himself. Fred Leuchter flew to Auschwitz in February 1988, 2 months before I saw his report, and for the next 2 or 3 days after his arrival in the Auschwitz site near Krakow in Poland, burrowed around in that rather gloomy and sinister environment with a bucket and spade, and took 38 samples out of the brickwork of those gas chambers in Auschwitz, which are shown to the tourists. It was, I suppose, heresy. It was treading on graves. But he brought back those 38 samples wrapped in vinyl plastic bags. And from that point on, he had nothing more to do with it. He sent them to a professional laboratory in Cornell University in New England. And it was the job of this laboratory to carry out the tests and to examine these samples of the brickwork and mortar and cement to see if there was any trace of hydrogen cyanide poison in the remains. Now you might think, hey, 50 years have passed. You're not going to find anything, are you? It's been washed out by the wind and rain. Well, the answer is yes, you will find something, because hydrogen cyanide, when it comes in contact with the iron content in brick, forms a very, very permanent compound indeed, ferric ferrocyanide, otherwise known as Prussian blue. It's so permanent, it's a dye stuff. And if you go to Auschwitz and have a look at the building, which was acknowledged by all sides as being the fumigation chamber for fumigating clothing, you can see the blue poison gas has seeped out of the fumigation chamber through the cracks in the brickwork and has stained the outside of the building this solid dark blue color. The laboratory that carried out the tests on these 38 samples found no significant trace of cyanide in the so-called homicidal gas chambers at all. Allegedly 1 million people had been gassed in these buildings, and yet there was no trace of the cyanide in them. They said they found significant traces of cyanide in the brickwork taken from the fumigation chamber, the blue walls, nothing at all of any significance in the so-called homicidal gas chambers. For me, that was a tilting point. I was no longer conformist. I became a deviationist, revisionist. The Leuchter report has been out there ever since. It is a significant document, and you can see how significant it is from the fact that the enemy, the conformist historians and the Jewish community, went to extraordinary lengths to smear Fred Leuchter from that moment on. This poor, inoffensive young man, the man who had taken no interest at all in politics, ended up selling matches on street corners. He ended up in fear of his life. His name vilified around the world by the very powerful organizations with a vested interest in perpetuating the Holocaust history. I, for my part, was a man they could not so easily dismiss. I came with a reputation as an historian, so they couldn't dismiss me so easily when I said in the witness box, as I did, that I'd seen no evidence that Adolf Hitler had ordered the gassing or liquidation of Germany's Jews, Europe's Jews. So they had to use a different tack with me. They attacked my publishers, they attacked the newspapers who supported me, and so on. But the Fred Leuchter report was, I think, the solid ground on which I based my skepticism. What do we know about those buildings? Well, if you go to Auschwitz now, the first thing you notice is it is marketed in the way that Disney markets Disneyland. There's a hot dog stand in the car park, which should tell you something about the buildings you're going to be visiting. They are being preserved for the purpose purely of making money. They show you a gas chamber in the Auschwitz camp, which is as genuine as the fairy castle is in Disneyland. In fact, it was built 3 years after the war was over, in 1948. If you go there now, thanks to us, the deviationists, the revisionists, the real historians, you'll find that the Polish authorities have now finally been forced to put in an inscription outside the gas chamber which says, oh, by the way, in very small print, this building was erected in 1948 as a replica. Well, you can call it a replica, I call it a fake. When I found out it was a fake built in 1948, I started saying so quite loudly. I remember the phrase I used to use going around Canada and speaking was, more women died on the back seat of Senator Edward Kennedy's car at Chappaquiddick than ever died in that building. Very tasteless, but you've got to be tasteless to make a point. And the point was remembered and well taken. And my opponents have never forgiven me for making the point so well. How many people did actually die in Auschwitz? It's a very interesting question. The figure is ballooned. And it's rather like the similar question, how many Russians died in World War II? Some people will say 40 million, because President Weizsäcker said 40 million Russians died in World War II. And the actual figure is less than 5 million. How do we know that? Well, if you go to the British archives, there's a private record taken by the interpreter of a meeting between Joseph Stalin, the Russian dictator, and Winston Churchill on July the 19th, 1945, when they met in Potsdam. And they're talking in private over dinner about who should get what in the dismemberment of Germany. And each side is boasting about the damages they suffered. And Stalin says to Churchill, we're entitled to far more, because you've got to realize that we lost many, many lives. Nearly 5 million Russians are dead or missing. He would have had no reason to minimize the figure. He would have had every reason to exaggerate the figure. And he said 5 million. But you see how it's ballooned since then. 5 million to 20 million to 40 million. And it's exactly the same with the Holocaust figures. How many died in the Holocaust? Well, the answer is a lot. How many died in Auschwitz? I think the best figure you can get as an estimate for Auschwitz is the figure given by the Polish authorities. The Poles you see in Krakow in 1947 put on trial all the Auschwitz top dogs. Rudolf Höss, the commandant, Aumeier, his deputy, Liebehenschel, the successor of Rudolf Höss, and the rest, 22 of them were put on trial in Krakow. A lot of them were sentenced to death, and the judgment was handed down, and in the judgment it says these people who are guilty had been the principal officers of a camp in which up to 300,000 people of all nationalities met their deaths. It doesn't say they were killed, it doesn't say they were gassed, it just says they died. Up to 300,000. You've got to realize this was the Polish courtroom which had all the Auschwitz documents and all the Auschwitz prisoners to interrogate. And the figure they used in their judgment as they sentenced these men to death was up to 300,000. So how suddenly did the figure balloon to 4 million on the memorial in the 1970s and 1980s? The communist director, the Jewish director of the Auschwitz State Museum, František Pieper, he eventually had that figure chiseled down and a new monument erected to the 1.2 million killed. I'm sorry for any individual innocent person who is killed. That is the real crime in my mind. The real crime really isn't genocide, which is this invented word used by our opponents. The real crime is what I call innocenticide, the killing of innocent people. It's a crime because the victims are innocent, not because they were Jewish innocent people. You see the difference? Once you start talking about innocent people being killed being the crime, the disadvantage for our opponents is that then suddenly all the global sympathy and treasure, the money, becomes entitled to a larger number of people who are not Jews. And so they don't talk about the innocent people being the victims, they talk about genocide. And that's not the real crime in my mind. So in Auschwitz, probably up to 300,000 people died. And I think that's a reasonable figure from the papers that I've read. What did they die from? Some were gassed. Aumeier, who was the deputy commandant of Auschwitz for nearly a year, 1942, 1943, he was taken prisoner by the British in Norway at the end of the war, and he was questioned extensively. None of the famous Holocaust historians bothered to look at Aumeier's writings, his manuscripts. I found them myself in 1992 in the British Public Record Office. I immediately tipped off Robert Jan van Pelt, who is the world's most famous Holocaust historian. I tipped off Deborah Lipstadt. I tipped off Martin Gilbert. I tipped off all the Holocaust historians and said I found the private papers of Aumeier, the deputy commandant of Auschwitz, including all his manuscript memoirs of life in Auschwitz and what he did as commandant. They never bothered to go and have a look. So what does Aumeier tell us? He tells us that when the trainloads began arriving in mid-1942 from all over Europe, he found a lot of the Jews couldn't be used. They were too old, too frail, too decrepit. He said, when these trainloads arrived, we selected those who were too frail to work, and we took them round the back and disposed of them in 2 little cottages, one called the White House and one called the Red House. You go to Auschwitz now as a tourist and ask the guides to show you the remains of the Red House and the White House. They will very reluctantly take you to have a look. But you really got to lean on them because they don't want you to see these. They want to take you to the huge crematoria buildings that they say were the gas chambers, the ones that Fred Leuchter examined and found no trace of cyanide in. Because you start coming up against logistics problems when you look at the remains of the little cottages. First of all, one cottage has nothing to be seen. The whole site's been grassed over. The other site, you can actually see the layout. You can see the foundations of the White House. The White House consists of 2 big rooms, and in that White House, Aumeier, the deputy commandant, says we could sometimes put as many as 200 people and we gassed them. From his writings, it doesn't appear to have been a very frequent operation. He says it was just now and again when trainloads came and they had unusable Jews aboard. So these gassings did occur. If you accept that these papers aren't fake, and I don't believe for a moment they are fake, the gassings did occur in Auschwitz, but on nothing like the scale, which is part of the legend now. The mass marketing scale that was designed in that Madison Avenue meeting back in the early 1970s. It's got to be unique, it's got to be bigger than anybody else's, and then you can make billions out of it. So is David Irving a Holocaust denier? I don't think so, because we now start looking totally elsewhere in Poland. We're looking no longer in Auschwitz, at this Disneyland site in southern Poland. We're looking in eastern Poland, along the River Bug. In eastern Poland, there are 3 or 4 sites which you can collectively describe either as the Bug River camps or as the Operation Reinhard camps. Some of the conformist historians say, oh yes, the Reinhard camps were named after Reinhard Heydrich, who was assassinated in May 1942. It's not. They were named after Fritz Reinhard, the civil servant, state secretary in the finance ministry in Germany, and that gives you a clue as to what the operation was. It was a thieving operation, a looting operation. The Jews were being sent to these camps, and before they were being liquidated, they were being robbed of everything they had. It was a plundering operation. And here is where I say I have to cross swords with the main revisionist body. They don't want to believe the Reinhard camps exist. I think the Reinhard camps did exist. And I'm going to set out here very briefly the evidence for the Reinhard camps having existed. I'll tell you the names first. There was Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And on top of that came the camp called Majdanek. You can go and visit all these camps in Poland now, but the reason they're not on the tourist route is because there's nothing to see. There's no buildings you can see, no execution walls, no buildings described as crematoria or gas chambers. They're just bald patches in the middle of a forest. And to me, that is far more evocative, far more lonely and sinister. And you go into the middle of this forest and suddenly there's a 1 or 2 kilometre square bald patch where nothing seems to have happened. Until you find, for example, at Treblinka, there's a letter in the private papers of Heinrich Himmler who says, when the operation in Treblinka is finished, I want the whole site demolished and removed, nothing must remain. I want the whole site grassed over and a farmstead built there in its place, which can be given to some Ukrainian to run. If you really know how to look at the private papers of Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, you begin stumbling across documents that have been clearly written as part of a cover-up. September 1942, he writes a letter to the chief of the Gestapo saying there's this very disturbing report in the London Daily Telegraph which has come into my hands, which says that the Jews are dying like flies in our camps. I want you to investigate this and find out just what is going on. Then you realize something that Hugh Trevor Roper, the famous British historian, told me many years ago in the 1960s. He said, David, when you look at a new document, ask yourself 3 questions. Is it genuine? Who wrote it? Is it written by somebody who is in a position to know? And thirdly, why does this document exist? And I know what he means. The Germans were in a habit of writing what they call Deckungsschreiben, cover-up letters, letters that would exonerate them in the case that things went wrong, alibis. And the letter from Himmler to Müller is a cover-up letter. In the autumn of 1944, he writes to Dr. Grawitz, who is one of the head doctors of the SS. And he says, Dr. Grawitz, a fascinating report you've written on the incidence of illnesses in the concentration camps. He says, one very odd thing strikes me. There appears to be nobody dying of cancer in the concentration camps. Can it be that we have inadvertently stumbled across a cure for cancer? Oh ho, it's a little private joke between the two of them. They know what's happening, why people aren't dying of cancer in the concentration camps. They've died for a totally different reason. So you begin looking at Himmler documents and wondering to yourself, is this a genuine document or not? And then when you travel around the world as I have, you come across documents for which there's no other explanation. They are genuine. In the Hoover archives at Stanford University in California, where they have part of Himmler's private papers, I came across 2 documents that have been sent to him. They are reports on the loot which has been yielded by Operation Reinhard. And it makes very grisly reading. The 2 documents list all the watches and fountain pens and gold coins and everything that have been taken off the people passing through Operation Reinhard. And you've got the report for 1942 and you've got the report for 1943. And all the valuables are being channeled back to Berlin for reprocessing and being put back on the market as part of a major systematic industrialized looting operation. Now for 1942, we've got a totally different set of figures in a document that I'm going to call the Höfler document. In January 1943, at the end of that year, Höfler, who is a police officer in Lublin, writes a report to Berlin saying the proceeds of the operations in 1942 are as follows. And he gives the most incredible breakdown of operations in 3 camps, which he identifies as T, S, and B. And he gives the total figure for the numbers we processed in each of those camps. And the overall figure up to the last day of 1942 is 1.24 million Jews. Now, the Höfler document, of course, is very significant. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to guess that T, S, and B are Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to guess what is happening to them in those camps. They're not being processed through them, they're being dealt with in them. So you've got a figure for 1942 of 1.24 million. But remember, we've also got the corresponding figure of the loot taken off them for 1942. We don't have a processing figure for 1943, but we do have the loot figure for 1943, and so you can probably extrapolate to a reasonable kind of ballpark figure for 1943 too, and say it's probably another million. So suddenly, for those 2 years, Operation Reinhard has generated 2.2 million people or more. Now for a revisionist, this is difficult stuff to swallow. And you're going to have to go back to the Höfler document and ask yourself the all-important question that Trevor Roper said. Question 1, is it genuine or not? Well, you can go to the Public Record Office in London and you can look at the actual document, decoded by the British. The difficulty is that the document contains anomalies. First of all, let me say that I'm 80% sure the document is genuine, but there's a 20% nagging residual doubt. First of all, it and the corresponding document that goes with it are addressed to Adolf Eichmann. Now, Adolf Eichmann is the big name. And one thing I spotted about fake documents is that they tend to be documents written about big names or by big names or to big names, because that's the kind of document collectors pay big money for. The next thing is the wording contained in the document does not conform with German civil service standards, which were very strictly adhered to. It just says, referring to your message, the answer is as follows. German civil service would require that document to say, referring to your message, register number so-and-so 12345, dated January the 10th, 1943, the answer is as follows. But there is neither a register number or a date in the document. Also, the document has got the highest possible security classification, and is only one of 3 documents in all the hundreds of thousands of decodes that I've read that has that top secret classification. A slightly lesser problem is that the totals don't add up. There's a digit wrong. Then you're left with the nagging suspicion. Is it a coincidence that that 7-digit figure it gives as the grand total is identical to the grand total given in a document called the Korher document? Richard Korher, Heinrich Himmler's chief statistician, at the same time ordered to draw up an overall 10-year report on the final solution to the Jewish problem. He sits down and he writes a report in which he says what has happened to all the Jews ever since the Nazis came to power. There were 17 million Jews in the world, 10 million of them in Europe, he says. Of these 10 million, there's still about 4 million left here. The rest have emigrated. And then he goes on to say 1.24 million Jews, however, were sent to the camps in occupied Poland, where they have been subjected to special treatment. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to guess what that word means. And Himmler didn't like it. And Himmler says, Dr. Korher, excellent report, well written, a bit too long though. You've got to remember, this report's going to be shown to Adolf Hitler, the Führer. I want you to write a short version. Oh, and that sentence where you say the 1.24 million were subjected to special treatment, I want you to reword that. The 1.24 million were sent through camps in occupied Poland to the east. Somebody's having the wool pulled over their eyes. But the significant thing is that figure is identical to the one in the Höfler document. Bit of a coincidence. Was the Höfler document based on the Korher document, perhaps? Was the Korher document based on the Höfler document? Is one or the other a fake? The Korher document, incidentally, makes no mention of Auschwitz. Here he is, a statistician, writing what happened to all the Jews, and yet Auschwitz doesn't actually figure. Well, if 4 million Jews are supposed to have died there or been killed there in gas chambers, that's a rather significant omission. If you really do your homework as a historian, you're left with these awkward problems. So what do I, after 30 or 40 years' work, believe at this stage? I believe the gassings did take place, but the whole thing was an ad hoc operation, designed and devised by the local commanders, except for the 3 Reinhard camps, which were built as extermination centers. No denying that. And it's a pity that the Jewish communities around the world have concentrated or latched onto Auschwitz as their Disneyland, because the real operations were done further east. Not much money to be made there, difficult to get to, and nothing to show the tourists, unless they're tourists who are romantic and can hear the sigh of the deceased and departed in the wind that blows through the pine forests. I'm not a romantic person. I like to see the documents. I like to see the evidence. I can't be intimidated, either by publishers or by newspapers or by journalists or by thugs with baseball bats. They've tried everything, and I still write what I find in the archives. But I do get good luck. 1991, I went to Buenos Aires to speak to audiences in Buenos Aires, in Spanish, of course. And at the end of one of these meetings, a man came up to me with a brown paper parcel, and he handed it to me. He is a man of Flemish origin. He lived in Buenos Aires, and he was close to a friend of Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann had been captured in Buenos Aires in 1960 by the Israeli commandos and taken to Israel and put on trial and hanged. I think he was a small cog, frankly. I don't think he was a very important man. But his family, worried that these Israeli commandos would raid his house next because he was kidnapped in the street, decided overnight to put all his private papers in the hands of a friend of the family. This friend of the family gave them to my man in Buenos Aires, who now handed this brown paper parcel to me. I took it back to England, and a few weeks passed before I actually opened it and began reading what Eichmann had been writing. He had begun at about 1956, writing his own memoirs, putting things down on paper, getting things straight in his own mind. He knew that there was an international hue and cry now. And he began writing his own memoirs down, repeating himself many, many times over. You can see the tendency to alibi beginning in it. More than once he says, I remember back in 1941 when Reinhard Heydrich came to me and said that Himmler has told me that the Führer has reached the decision that the Jews had to be physically annihilated. People point that to me and say, there you are, David. That's the evidence. Hitler was involved. I don't think so. I got evidence there only of Adolf Eichmann being involved, and of Adolf Eichmann sitting down in the 1950s realizing that the day is going to come when he does have his day in court, and the only thing that will get him off the hook is if he says, I was carrying out Hitler's orders. That's the way the human mind works. I'm not saying he consciously did it. It's more likely that Heydrich came to him one day and said, the Führer, Adolf Hitler, has ordered, he wants the Jews all out of Europe. And from that had then developed the more radical version. Clearly, if such an order existed, you would expect to find it on paper. You would expect the British to have decoded it somewhere. And after 60 years, we're entitled to expect such an order to come. As you probably know, ever since my book on Adolf Hitler, Hitler's War, was published in 1977, I've offered a £1,000 reward for anybody who can find one wartime document showing that Adolf Hitler even knew about Auschwitz, let alone gave orders for the killing of the Jews. The only documents we gradually find run the other way. We find that on the day that Auschwitz was overrun by the Red Army in January 1945, the chief of the German General Staff comes to Hitler and says at the war conference, which is written down by shorthand writers, yesterday the Red Army overran Auschwitz, mein Führer, and Hitler a few seconds later saying, well, what does he say? Does he say, oh my God, I hope we managed to destroy everything before the Russians find it, so they've got no trace of what we've been up to? No, he just says, okay, jawohl, means nothing to him. when I wrote my Hitler biography. I picked only genuine documents, ones that I was pretty satisfied that were genuine. At that time, we didn't have any of the decodes, of course. I picked documents that had been on Hitler's desk, documents of which he was aware. I had a pretty strict criterion I applied, and you get a very different picture then. You get a picture then of Adolf Hitler putting out his hand and protecting the Jews every time there was any risk of any harm being done to them. And for a long time, I was way out alone on a short plank, in my opinion, that Adolf Hitler was not an anti-Semite during the war years. But I'm glad to see now that an Austrian professor, who's probably risking her own liberty in saying this, a professor at the University of Vienna, Brigitte Hamann, has published a book called Hitler in Vienna, in which she comes to exactly the same opinion, that during World War II, after he came to power, Adolf Hitler was not an anti-Semite. Okay, he made these speeches. Prophetic warning to the world's Jews. This is the famous speech of January the 30th, 1939. I've had it on my wall ever since Henrietta von Schirach gave me these copies of the Nazi newspaper. But if you open that page, you take it out of its frame, and you open the newspaper up, you find the actual speech is 6 pages long, and the reference to the Jews is only 3 or 4 lines long. That's what his interest was. But it was the Nazis who were with him, Rosenberg and Bormann and Himmler and the others, Adolf Eichmann, from the top dogs down to the junior ones. They were the ones who wanted to carry out the campaign to its murderous conclusion. Adolf Hitler was more interested in winning the war. We got episodes of this throughout the war years. A famous episode, November the 30th, 1941. He found out that a trainload of Jews was leaving Berlin and heading to Riga on the Eastern Territories. And Himmler came to him and said, why don't we just liquidate them? We can't house them. And Hitler says, that's out of the question. And Himmler had to telephone Heydrich. We got his own handwritten telephone notes saying, keine Liquidierung, not to be liquidated. And it was too late. They were already dead. They were already lying face down, dead, sardine fashion in pits, all machine gunned to death, 1,000 Berlin Jews that morning in the pits outside Riga, along with 4,000 local Jews from Riga who had been swept up in a liquidation action by SS Gruppenführer Jeckeln, who was the chief of the SS and police. And the interesting thing now is that we have the intercepted messages that passed between Himmler and Jeckeln that very day. That morning, Jeckeln sends him a message saying, Herr Reichsführer, can you get for me 12 more of those fantastic Finnish-made Tommy guns, the ones with the drum magazines, because they're ideal for our Sonderaktionen, our special operations, meaning the killing operations. The message which Jeckeln gets back that evening is anything but what he expected. Himmler says, the operation you carried out in Riga grossly violates the guidelines laid down by me and Heydrich. Any such further excesses will be ruthlessly punished. You are to report to headquarters. It's not the picture you get, you see, when you read the books by Martin Gilbert and the others. Something is going wrong. Something is very haphazard on the Eastern Front. And from Himmler's diary, we see that Jeckeln came to see him on December the 4th. And they had supper together and talked about Judenfrage, the Jewish problem. That's what I call real history. And you get the image that something is going wrong, something is not wanted by Hitler's headquarters. And in fact, on that very day, November the 30th, there's a German army colonel who hears what's happening to the Jews outside the town. And he's lost all his Jews that day, and he's wondering where his Jewish workers have gone. The local SS guy says, well, if you want to know what's happening to your Jewish friends, you better drive out town down the road to Dvinsk, about 8 kilometers, and you'll see what's happening to your lovely Jews. And the colonel describes in April 1945, 2 or 3 pits had been dug out, and truckloads of Jews were being driven up and made to lie down in the pits, sardine fashion, and they were being machine gunned to death by these men standing on the rim. And he says, we discussed it among ourselves. Somebody had to tell the Führer, Adolf Hitler, what was going on. So we sent for a lieutenant and told him to come out later that day, see what was going on and write a report. And we sent his report up to Hitler's headquarters. And that evening the order came that this kind of shooting had to stop immediately, forthwith. You won't find that in the books by Martin Gilbert either, because they can't fit it in. They can't fit any of these documents in. In the spring of 1942, after the Wannsee Conference, where they discussed the logistics, the transportation movements of Hitler's order that all the Jews had to be thrown out of Germany and shipped to the east. This was Hitler's order, without question. And a month later, another conference took place, and the report on that was circulated among the ministers. And you can see a reference to it in Goebbels' diary. He says, well, obviously not much is going to remain of the Jews when all this operation's over, he says. You can say that probably 80% of them are going to be wiped out and 20% will be put to work. But a number of other ministers are very worried about that. The Minister of Justice, Schlegelberger, writes a memorandum, a letter to the Chief of the Civil Service, Dr. Lammers, and he says, what's going on here? He says, I can see that if we go on down this particular road, the Führer Adolf Hitler may find himself stampeded into decisions that we'll later regret. Lammers writes back to him saying, I think you're right. I'll come to Berlin at the end of this month, March 1942, and we'll have to talk about it. And Lammers came to see Schlegelberger, the Minister of Justice, who's a lawyer, of course. And the lawyer Schlegelberger sits down and he writes a memorandum, which I can quote you verbatim because I've read it so often. Reich Minister Dr. Lammers has informed me that the Führer, that's Adolf Hitler, has repeatedly ordained that he wants the solution of the Jewish problem postponed until after the war is over. We got that actual memorandum. It vanished in Nuremberg. You couldn't find it because the American lawyers in Nuremberg, I know who it was, actually destroyed the negative photocopy they'd made. It vanished from the file because they can't use a document like that, showing Hitler saying nothing must happen. I want everything left until the war's over. Typical Hitler. Procrastinator, but also he wanted to win the war first. He said, let's win this war first. We're in difficulty on the Eastern Front. We don't need all your problems. Let's win the war first, and then we can deal with the churches and the Jews and all the other little subsidiary problems that are fascinating and obsessing you guys. But the Holocaust historians like Longerich or Martin Gilbert or Robert Jan van Pelt, to them this is a square document and they can't ram it into their own round Holocaust hole. And so what do? They toss it under the table and hope nobody will find it. And along comes this dreadful David Irving and found the document and says, how do you explain this then? How do you square this with your theories? Arrest that man. He's a fascist. He's a Holocaust denier. Ruin him. Smash him. But the document is still there in the archive. We found the actual document now. It's in the German government archives. Hitler ordering the solution to the Jewish problem, the Holocaust, whatever the others were asking for. Hold it off, fellas, until this war is finished. It's there in black and white. All the rest is pure guff. Longerich and the other historians who waffled on about Hitler and the final solution and Himmler, they come up with their theories and then admit, well, I've got no documents that support my theories. But here I come to them with a document written by somebody who knows, written by the chief of the Ministry of Justice, based on a conversation with the head of the civil service, who's been close to Hitler. They're talking about Hitler, they're talking about the final solution to the Jewish problem, they're talking about dates and decisions, and yet you won't find this document mentioned in a single book written by these conformist historians. It reminds me of another document, The Night of Broken Glass, 1938, when Goebbels, the evil genius behind Hitler's bench, ordered all the synagogues burned down and attacked, and all the Jews rounded up and harassed and molested and terrorized. And Hitler is totally in the dark. Hitler's private staff, they said to me, Herr Irving, we were with the chief Adolf Hitler that night in Munich. We were in our apartment beneath his. We got word from the hotel to come immediately and get our baggage because a synagogue was on fire next door to the hotel. And we went upstairs and told the chief. And Hitler said, what's going on then? Find out. And he sent for Goebbels. He sent for Himmler, the chief of the SS. And he was furious. He was livid with rage. And all night long, he orders Goebbels and the others to issue orders to stop this madness. And in the archives, I found one of these orders, signed by Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, sent out by his office. 10 o'clock, 10th of November, 1938. Again, it's only 2 or 3 lines long. It says, on orders from the very highest level. If you're the deputy to Hitler and you say this is orders from the highest level, this is the guy above you, Adolf Hitler himself. On orders from the very highest level, there are to be no acts of arson or outrages against Jewish property under any circumstances whatsoever. I'm not going to bore you with all the other documents, but there's a chain of documents that I put before the court in the Lippstadt trial that show Adolf Hitler trying to stop ugly things happening to the Jews again and again. In 1943, October 1943, the German diplomat in Rome, which had just been occupied by the Nazis, sends a message to the German Foreign Ministry saying the SS chief here in Rome has told me that he's received orders to round up the 12,000 Jews in Rome and send them to northern Italy where they are to be liquidated. He uses the word liquidated. Ribbentrop, who is the German Foreign Ministry, goes to see Hitler 2 days later. And later that day, Ribbentrop sends a message back to the German consul in Rome saying the Führer has ordered that the Jews of Rome are to be sent to Auschwitz and to be kept alive as hostages, kept as pawns. I brought this up in the Lippstadt trial, and immediately, of course, the conformist historians become contortionist historians. They go into contortions then to try to explain that that document meant everything else but what it actually said on the face of it. I remember questioning the chief expert witness in the Lippstadt trial about the one I mentioned just now, about the Night of Broken Glass. I said, here you've got a 2-line document showing quite clearly Hitler intervening on the highest orders to stop the outrages. How do you explain that? He said, oh, I read this document totally differently. I read this as Hitler saying, well, go ahead, fellows, carry on brutalizing and bashing up the Jews and throwing them into concentration camps and murdering them and burning down the synagogues. But watch out for the property that's next door to German property in case you damage the German property. I remember saying to him, Professor Evans, you read all that into those 2 lines, do you? Heavy sarcasm. So you get this picture of not an actually benevolent Adolf Hitler, but a Hitler who couldn't really care about the Jewish problem in the war years. And I'm going to end on the very last moment, of course, of Hitler's life, when he took his own life on April the 30th, 1945. I remember speaking to his secretary, Traudl Junger. Traudl Junger was his youngest and most beautiful secretary. He sent to Traudl Junger in the bunker just after the wedding to Eva Braun. And Frau Junger said to me, she said, Mr. Irving, the chief sent for me, and he said, Frau Junger, come into the adjoining room, will you please, and bring your shorthand pad. And no sooner did he close the door than he immediately began dictating, without any notes, off the top of his head. And I realized he was dictating his final testament, his last will and testament, his political testament. And halfway down that political testament, you come to a sentence which has baffled historians. From memory, it's roughly, he says, I command my successor, Admiral Dönitz, to carry on the remorseless fight against the Jews, which we have carried on for the last 12 years, although we have used methods that are far more humane than have the enemy, the Allies, with their ruthless bombing war against German civilians in the German cities. And it's the word humane that baffles people. They say, how can Hitler say what he was doing to the Jews was humane? Well, just possibly he wasn't in the loop. just possibly Himmler was doing things that Hitler wasn't aware of. And this isn't just a weird theory, because Himmler's chief of staff, General Karl Wolff, he survived after the war a long time because he had done a deal with the Allies. He wrote private memoirs, which he deposited in the Institute of History in Munich, on the condition they remained confidential. And for many years they remained confidential, but my historian friends there let me read them. And Wolff says, I remember in August 1942 discussing with Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, and he was particularly depressed and dejected. And I said, why are you depressed, Chief? And Himmler replied, I am doing something of which the Messiah of the coming 2,000 years must never learn. Karl Wolff goes on to say, I didn't realize what he was talking about at the time, but now, of course, I do. This was right at the height of Operation Reinhard. And finally, other historians like Longerich are coming round to my viewpoint that probably Hitler himself was being kept deliberately out of the loop. Longerich writes in his latest Himmler biography, if you read the Heinrich Himmler speeches carefully, you see that he's very careful not to claim that he's acting on orders from Hitler. And the language he uses leaves strongly the impression to the historian that in fact he was acting on his own. At one point in a speech in October 1943, in a speech to SS generals, he says, I know a lot of you understand why we're killing the Jews, but a lot of you don't quite understand why we're also killing the women and children. I have taken this decision myself because it would be wrong to leave coming generations to deal with this problem all over again. So again, he could so easily have said, Hitler has taken this decision, but he doesn't. He says, I have taken this decision. And again, in that famous message to General Jeckeln at Riga, he says, you've exceeded the guidelines laid down by myself and by Heinrich. He doesn't say the guidelines laid down by Hitler. So in summary, what do I believe happened? There are two kinds of killing of the Jews. There was the killing of the Jews in camps like Auschwitz, where excess Jews were disposed of because they couldn't be put to work as slave labor on a comparatively small scale. And there was the systematic mopping up operations behind the Eastern Front in cities like Riga and Minsk. Minsk was in White Russia. The governor of White Russia was Wilhelm Kuber. Kuber's son lives in Argentina. Now, his son recently sent me 200 negative photographs from his father's collection. I scanned these in very close detail, and I've enlarged one of the scans. One of the photographs shows just a huge heap of baggage. An empty street, a heap of about 200 suitcases and trunks piled up on the sidewalk beside the street. And if you zoom in on the labels on one of the bags, you can see the name begins with Sarah, so it's probably a Jew. This was typical of what happened in Minsk. The Jews were liquidated in Minsk as well. I think there's no question that the Jews in Minsk and Riga and other cities along the Eastern Front, particularly down the far south, they were rounded up and taken out into the outskirts, out of sight, and liquidated as part of the anti-partisan operations, preemptive killing. So this did happen. It happened on a huge scale. I think the Jews have made a big mistake in trying to sweep it all up into one concept, the Holocaust with a capital H, and market that in the same way they would market headache tablets, just to make money. It has, I think, debased the whole of this vast human tragedy. They should be asking themselves, can this happen again? Why did it happen in the first place? Why us? They never ask the why us question, because even posing the why us question is considered to be anti-Semitic, the suggestion that they themselves are partly to blame for their own tragedy, the architects of their own misfortune. I think these things should be looked at closely. Nobody would want a tragedy like this to happen on this kind of scale again. The whole German people now bearing the guilt for the crimes committed by a few people in their name. It may happen again, of course, because it has not been systematically and properly researched. It is wrong that historians who deviate from the official line should be penalized and criminalized and cast into prison for asking awkward questions.